Get your greasy hands off me, dishwasher. You're going to ruin my silk dress. The voice was a screech, cutting right through the smooth jazz drifting over the ballroom. A woman with too much Botox and a dress that cost more than my beat-up Ford stepped back, swatting at the air as if my very presence was a disease. I didn't blink. I didn't apologize. I just pulled back my tray of dirty champagne flutes. My hands were red, cracked, smelling of industrial bleach and cheap lemon soap. It was a stench that cut straight through the heavy, suffocating cloud of Chanel No. 5 choking the room. I liked the bleach. It was honest. It scrubbed the noise out of my head. Down here, scraping duck confit off porcelain plates for minimum wage, I didn't have to think. I didn't have to make choices that ended up in body bags. I turned to head back to the kitchen. Then a heavy thud shook the Persian rug. The jazz music ground to a halt. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. I stopped. My spine straightened into a rigid line. It wasn't a conscious choice. It was a reflex drilled into my bones at Paris Island. Over my shoulder, the groom was on the floor. Daniel Mercer. The golden boy of the evening. He was sprawled on his back, his limbs twisted at awkward angles. The crowd of white-collar elites broke into absolute chaos. Women in diamond chokers shrieked, backing away to protect their hemlines. Men in custom tuxedos froze, holding their scotch glasses, staring like deer in headlights. Not a single one of them dropped to their knees. They had millions in their bank accounts, but right now they were utterly useless. My eyes locked onto the groom. The clinical checklist booted up in my brain, cold and fast. Lips, blue, cyanosis. Chest, still. No rise, no fall. Eyes, rolled back. Apnea, sudden cardiac arrest. He had about 3 minutes before brain damage started, maybe 5 before he was a corpse in a very expensive suit. I set the tray down on a nearby table. A flute tipped over, shattering on the marble floor. I didn't care. I moved. I pushed through the wall of silk and velvet. Hey, what the hell do you think you're doing? A man stepped in my path. Groomsman, hair slicked back, jaw tight. He looked at my soaked apron, his upper lip curling in pure disgust. Get back to the kitchen. We're calling a real doctor. He reached out and grabbed my shoulder. Big mistake. I didn't speak. I didn't warn him. My left hand shot up, trapping his wrist. I pivoted my hip, stepping inside his guard, and wrenched his arm backward into a standard USMC joint lock. The pressure was exact. Just enough to send a blinding flash of pain up his radial nerve without snapping the bone. He let out a pathetic yelp as his knees buckled. I shoved him hard to the side. He crashed into a cocktail table, sending ice and whiskey flying. I stepped over his legs and dropped to my knees beside the groom. Time slowed down. The screaming around me faded into a dull, underwater hum. Daniel's silk dress shirt was in the way. I grabbed the collar in both fists and ripped it open in one violent motion. Buttons popped like tiny gunshots, scattering across the rug. I placed the heel of my right hand directly on the center of his sternum. I locked my left hand over it, lacing my fingers together. My hands, thick with calluses from gripping a scalpel under fire from racking the slide of an M9 pistol. Rough, ugly hands. I locked my elbows. Push hard. Push fast. 1, 2, 3, 4. The physical resistance of the human chest is heavy. You have to push past the meat and muscle. On the third compression, I felt the sickening, distinct crunch of cartilage giving way under my weight. Oh my God, she's breaking his ribs. Stop her! A woman shrieked from the crowd. Let them scream. You don't do CPR to keep someone pretty. You do it to pump blood to a dying brain. 30 compressions, 2 breaths, back to the chest. Sweat dripped down my forehead, stinging my eyes. The posh ballroom vanished. In my head, I wasn't on a Persian rug in Boston. I was on the bloody floor of a medevac chopper. The air smelled of sand and copper. The rhythmic thump of the rotors matched the rhythm of my chest compressions. Keep the tempo. Stay in the zone. Get her off him, security. Heavy boots pounded against the marble floor. 3 security guards in cheap suits were rushing in, reaching for their radios, ready to drag the crazy dishwasher away. I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I leaned my entire upper body weight into the next downward thrust. Then a voice cut through the room. Stand down. It wasn't a yell. It was a command, a low, gravelly baritone that carried the absolute, unquestionable weight of a man who had sent thousands of boys to die. The security guards froze mid-step. The entire ballroom went dead silent. Footsteps approached. Slow, measured. The hard click of military-issue dress shoes hitting marble. General Thomas Mercer stepped into my peripheral vision. 4 stars pinned to a chest full of ribbons. He was a gray wolf in a room full of toy poodles. He looked at his dying son on the floor. Then he looked at my locked elbows, my bleeding knuckles, my flawless rhythm. "Nobody touches her." The general barked, his eyes scanning the terrified crowd. "Let her work." I didn't look up. I gave it 10 more compressions. Deep, brutal. Suddenly Daniel's body jerked. A harsh, wet gasp tore out of his throat. His chest heaved on its own. The blue tint on his lips began to recede, replaced by the angry flush of returning blood flow. He coughed, turning his head, vomiting slightly onto the rug. He was breathing. I sat back on my heels. My breath was steady. My heart rate was barely elevated. The silence in the room was deafening. The socialites who had just called me trash were staring at me with their mouths hanging open. The groomsman I'd thrown to the floor was clutching his wrist, looking at me like I was a ghost. General Mercer knelt opposite me. He placed a hand on his son's shoulder, then lifted his eyes. Cold, calculating eyes that recognized exactly what I was. He opened his mouth, preparing to ask the question that would drag me back into the light. I didn't give him the chance. I stood up. My knees popped. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling just a little. Not from fear, but from the adrenaline of the kill zone leaving my system. I wiped the grease and sweat onto my soaked, filthy apron. I didn't nod. I didn't wait for applause. I turned my back on the 4-star general, the gasping groom, and the millions of dollars of gaping wealth. I walked straight to the kitchen. I pushed through the heavy stainless steel doors, letting them swing shut behind me, cutting off the noise of the ballroom. The kitchen was empty. The air was thick with steam. I walked over to the deep industrial sink. I turned the faucet on high. The water was scalding hot. I plunged my hands straight into it. The burning sensation bit into my skin, sharp and real. It was exactly what I needed. I closed my eyes as the steam hit my face, but the heat didn't wash it away. It never did. The scalding water pouring over my fingers morphed into the cold, sterile wash of an operating room scrub station. The harsh fluorescent lights of the Boston 5A hospital flickered in my mind, casting long, dark shadows over a memory I had buried deep. A memory of 2 men on stretchers, and a choice that ruined my life. The water in the deep industrial sink was blistering. It chewed at the skin on my bare hands. I kept them submerged. I closed my eyes, letting the grease-scented steam coat my face, hoping the heat would burn the adrenaline out of my system. It did not work. The heat betrayed me. In my mind, the boiling water turned freezing. The heavy, foul air of the restaurant kitchen vanished, replaced by the sterile chemical bite of iodine and the low, throbbing hum of a diesel backup generator. Boston, 5 years, 80A Hospital. 3 years ago. A winter nor'easter had knocked out the regional power grid. The emergency lights bathed the trauma bay in a sickly, jaundiced glow. We had 1 operating room running on backup juice, 1 functional ventilator. The double doors smashed open. Paramedics wheeled in 2 stretchers, the rubber wheels skidding hard on the linoleum. Blood dripped, pooling into dark, sticky puddles on the floor. On the left stretcher, Daniel Mercer. Mid-20s, massive blunt force trauma from a severe wreck on the interstate. Internal bleeding. His liver was lacerated, dumping blood into his abdomen. On the right stretcher, Earl Patterson, 70 years old, Army combat veteran, end-stage respiratory failure. His chest heaved in shallow, useless jerks. His lips were the color of bruised plums. He was drowning in the open air. I stood between them. The noise of the room faded. Paramedics shouting rapid-fire vitals, nurses scrambling over overturned trays for crash carts. It all became white noise. I was no longer a civilian doctor in a modern hospital. I was a Marine medical officer standing on a hostile landing zone. Triage is not about compassion. It is brutal, mathematical, and soulless. You do not save the most deserving. You save the most likely to survive. I looked at the monitor attached to Daniel. His blood pressure was crashing, but his youth was a heavy weapon. Immediate surgery to pack the liver, and he had an 80% chance of walking out of the building. I looked at Earl. The old soldier locked eyes with me. His gaze was milky and terrified, but underneath the panic, there was a quiet, crushing understanding. His lungs were already destroyed. Intubating him and putting him on the only ventilator would only delay the inevitable by a few days. 10% chance, maybe less. One machine. 2 dying men. Dr. Sharp, a trauma nurse, screamed over the chaos, gripping the rails of a stretcher. Who goes in? I did not hesitate. I did not pray. I did not ask for a second opinion. I raised a blood-soaked latex glove and pointed directly at the rich kid with the shattered liver. Take the kid. Prep OR1. Push 2 units of O negative now. The medic shoved Daniel's stretcher forward, crashing through the heavy surgical doors. I stayed with Earl. I did not walk away. I owed him that much. I stood over his stretcher, gripping the cold steel railing as his lungs finally surrendered. His chest gave one final violent shudder. The heart monitor flatlined, emitting a solid, unbroken tone that drilled straight through my skull. I reached down, placing 2 fingers on his scarred neck. Nothing. I pulled the white sheet over his face. I killed him. It was the right call, dictated by the absolute rules of triage. But I still killed him. The high-pitched hum of the flatline dissolved into the sharp, aggressive smack of a heavy leather folder hitting a glass table. 1 week later, the executive boardroom of the Sharp family empire. Soundproof glass walls. A breathtaking panoramic view of the Boston skyline. The air conditioning was cranked so high the room felt like a meat locker. My uncle Arthur Sharp, the hospital director, leaned back in his leather chair. He threw a stack of printed emails across the table. The local press is sniffing around the Patterson case. Arthur sneered, his voice dripping with pure corporate venom. A decorated military veteran left to die in the hallway of our hospital. The optics are a total disaster. The Department of Defense is threatening to pull our trauma research grant. I sat at the opposite end of the long table, back straight, shoulders squared, feet flat on the floor. I did not look at the papers. I looked at the man sitting at the head of the table. Dr. Richard Sharp, Chief of Surgery, Chairman of the Board, my biological father. He tapped his $3,000 Mont Blanc pen against the glass top. Once, twice. He did not look at me like a daughter. He looked at me like a toxic asset on a balance sheet. You breached protocol, Holly, Richard stated. His voice was completely devoid of emotion. Flat, empty. The hospital cannot afford a federal investigation right now. Our investors are getting nervous. We need a firewall. I performed standard triage. I replied, my voice steady, betraying nothing. The backup generator failed. Maintenance ignored the work orders for 6 months to save budget space. You signed those budget cuts, Richard. He stopped tapping the pen. He leaned forward, resting his tailored suit elbows on the glass. You made a fatal medical error under extreme pressure. He corrected his tone, leaving absolutely no room for debate. You will sign the admission of guilt. The medical board will suspend your license indefinitely. The family requires your sacrifice to protect the hospital. He slid a single sheet of paper across the table. A typed confession. A death warrant for my entire career. Next to it, an official corporate seal came down with a heavy final thud. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The sound snapped me back to the present. The sterile, air-conditioned boardroom shattered, replaced by the humid, grease-stained walls of the restaurant kitchen. I was driving a ball of steel wool into the bottom of a blackened cast-iron skillet. My knuckles were bone white. The steel wool cut into the skin of my fingers, drawing thin, stinging lines of blood that washed away in the gray, soapy water. I dug in harder. The physical pain was a relief. It was simple. It made perfect sense. It drowned out the memory of my own flesh and blood, trading my life for a spike in quarterly profits. In the Middle East, I had surrendered my gas mask in a sandstorm to save a private in my unit. I came home only to have my father cut my oxygen line to save a percentage point on a stock portfolio. Hey, dishwasher, shift is over. Get out. The floor manager kicked the swinging door open, barking the order before vanishing back into the dining room. I dropped the skillet into the sink. I dried my hands on a rough cotton towel, stripped off the foul-smelling apron, and tossed it into the laundry bin. I grabbed my faded canvas jacket from a rusty iron hook. I pushed through the heavy back exit door. The Boston winter hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The night air was jagged, tasting of road salt and diesel exhaust fumes. The back alleyway was dark, illuminated only by a single flickering halogen bulb buzzing weakly overhead. Loose, icy gravel crunched under the thick soles of my boots. I pulled my collar up against the biting wind and walked toward the far end of the desolate employee lot. My beat-up Ford pickup was parked deep in the shadows, its rusted bumper reflecting the dim yellow light. I reached into my pocket for my keys. My fingers brushed the cold brass, but I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The raw animal instinct that kept me alive in Fallujah flared to life, hot and sharp in my chest. I was not alone. Standing perfectly still, leaning against the driver's side door of my truck was a massive silhouette. A man. Waiting quietly in the freezing dark, the heavy steel door of the restaurant's rear exit slammed shut. It cut off the muffled clatter of porcelain plates and the shouting of the line cooks. Instantly, the Boston winter hit me like a physical assault. The temperature was hovering in the low teens. The wind howled off the harbor, whipping through the narrow brick alleyway, carrying the harsh, abrasive smell of road salt, frozen garbage, and diesel exhaust. I pulled the collar of my faded canvas jacket up, bearing my chin into the cheap fabric. My boots crushed the loose, icy gravel scattered across the asphalt. I kept my head down, sticking to the deep shadows cast by the brick walls, making my way toward the desolate employee parking lot. The single halogen street lamp flickered overhead, buzzing with a sick, erratic rhythm. My rusted Ford F-150 sat parked in the furthest corner, swallowed by the dark. I reached a cracked, blistered hand into my pocket for my keys. Then I stopped. My boots froze on the gravel. A massive silhouette stood next to the driver's side door. My right hand dropped instantly to my hip. It was an empty gesture. There was no M9 Beretta strapped to my thigh, just worn denim. But the muscle memory from Fallujah never really faded. It stayed wired into the nervous system. I widened my stance, shifting my weight to the balls of my feet, dropping my center of gravity. The figure shifted. The dim yellow light caught the sharp, unmistakable glint of 4 silver stars pinned to the collar of a heavy wool overcoat. General Thomas Mercer. 50 feet away, a blacked-out Chevy Tahoe sat idling in the gloom. The exhaust plumed thick and white into the freezing air. He had brought a driver, but the general had approached my truck alone. He wasn't here to send a thank you card. His posture was rigid. Predator mode. "Since when do you keep your head down and run from a fight, Major?" His voice was a low, gravelly rumble. It cut straight through the howling wind. I didn't flinch. I kept my hand hovering near my pocket. "I am on administrative suspension. Excuse me, sir. I need to get to my vehicle." I stepped forward, aiming for the door handle. He didn't move an inch. He owned the space. When I tried to step around him, he shifted his massive frame, deliberately closing the gap. He pressed his body weight forward, forcing me to back up until my spine hit the rusted quarter panel of my truck. The metal was dead cold, seeping straight through my jacket. He loomed over me. The scent of expensive Cuban cigars and heavy starch rolled off his overcoat. He wasn't looking at the woman in the grease-stained clothes who had just shattered his son's sternum to restart his heart. He was looking at a soldier who had broken rank. "You saved my boy tonight," Mercer stated. The words lacked any warmth. They sounded like a tactical observation. It was a basic medical intervention. He was in sudden cardiac arrest. I did what was required. "I'm not talking about tonight." He leaned in closer. The air between us turned suffocating. 3 years ago, VA hospital. The power grid failed. You had 1 ventilator. You chose Daniel over Earl Patterson. You let a decorated combat veteran suffocate to death on a hallway gurney. I stared straight at the tight knot of his silk tie. I didn't blink. I locked my jaw so tight my teeth ached. "I read the disciplinary board's report," Mercer continued. His voice dropped an octave, turning into a weapon. "Negligence. Failure to follow established triage protocols. They stripped your medical command. They threw you out of the hospital with a dishonorable stain on your record." He paused. His sharp gray eyes scanned my face, searching for a micro-expression. A twitch. A sign of weakness. But the math doesn't add up. The general pressed his words deliberate and heavy. You were top of your class at Bethesda. You did 3 tours in the sandbox. You don't panic under fire. So why didn't you fight the board's findings? Why did you sign a confession that looked like it was drafted by a team of corporate crisis managers? He knew. The old wolf smelled the blood in the water. He knew the hospital administration had altered the after-action reports to protect their massive Department of Defense funding grants. He knew perfectly well that Dr. Richard Sharp, my own father, had drafted that confession. He knew I was the sacrificial lamb slaughtered to keep the family's stock prices stable. I felt the freezing wind burn the skin on my cheeks. My hands were shoved deep into my pockets now, my fingernails biting hard into the calluses on my palms. I could end the interrogation right now. I could open my mouth and tell him exactly how Arthur and Richard Sharp had slid that typed paper across a glass table and demanded my career. I could play the victim. I could beg for his high-ranking sympathy. I didn't open my mouth. A Marine does not whine. You do not show the enemy your bleeding wounds, and you certainly don't cry about friendly fire to an outsider. The men who betrayed me were cowards. They weren't worth the breath it would take to speak their names into the winter air. I took the bullet. That was the job. The military trained me to absorb the impact and keep moving. The board's report stands general. I made the call. My voice was dead flat, stripped of all emotion. Mercer's eyes narrowed. He was trying to crush me with his presence, pushing his 4-star authority down on my shoulders like a physical weight. I pushed back with absolute unbreakable silence. The wind whipped a piece of frozen trash across the asphalt, the plastic scraping loudly against the ground. Let me ask you something, Major. He used the title as a test. If you were standing in that trauma bay right now, the power is out. The backup generator is failing. You have one machine. You have my son, and you have Sergeant Patterson. He took a slow, measured breath, letting the icy air fill his chest. Would you do anything differently? The parking lot went completely dead quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I pulled my hands out of my jacket pockets. I stopped leaning against the rusted side of the truck. I straightened my spine, rolling my shoulders back and locking my knees. My chin came up, leveling out. Perfect position of attention. I looked directly into the cold, calculating eyes of the man who could end what was left of my life with a single phone call. No, sir. 2 words. Cold as the ice under our boots. I wouldn't change a damn thing. Triage is brutal math. Earl's lungs were destroyed. Daniel had an 80% survival rate. I made the hard choice, and I would make it again. I would not apologize for executing my duty. Mercer stared at me. The silence dragged out for 10 agonizing seconds. He was looking for a crack in the armor. He was looking for regret. He found solid, reinforced concrete. Slowly, the tension in his massive shoulders broke. He gave a single microscopic nod of his head. He reached into the deep, tailored pocket of his overcoat. He pulled his hand out and tossed a heavy metallic object through the air. My reflexes fired instantly. I snatched it out of the dark before it could hit the ground. A heavy leather-bound key fob. I looked down at the keys in my palm, then back up at the general. Mercer turned around. The gravel crunched heavily under his dress shoes as he walked back toward the idling Tahoe. He pulled open the heavy armored door, pausing for a fraction of a second before climbing into the heated cabin. Tomorrow morning, 0700. The general commanded, his voice hard as iron over the engine noise. You drive. There is someone you need to apologize to. The heavy SUV door slammed shut. 700 hours. The heavy steel door of the blacked-out Chevy Tahoe slammed shut, sealing us inside a soundproof vault of leather and forced heat. Outside the tinted windows, a Massachusetts blizzard was tearing the city apart. The snow blew sideways in violent, blinding sheets. General Mercer sat in the passenger seat. I drove. He tossed me the keys and I took the wheel. That was the dynamic. I did not ask where we were going. The GPS coordinates were already locked into the dashboard screen. We rolled out of my broken-down neighborhood, the heavy off-road tires crushing the ice on the asphalt. The drive took an hour. We did not speak a single word. The silence in the cabin was heavy, pressing down on my chest like a physical weight. The heater blasted dry air across my face, but I could not shake the deep, bone-rattling cold that had settled into my marrow. I kept both hands on the steering wheel, my knuckles white, my eyes locked on the treacherous road ahead. The GPS directed us through a massive set of wrought iron gates, the Massachusetts National Cemetery. I cut the engine. We stepped out into the storm. The wind howled off the Atlantic, biting violently at my exposed neck. I zipped my faded canvas jacket up to my chin. Mercer wore his heavy wool overcoat. He did not flinch against the cold. He started walking. I fell into step beside him, heel to toe. A tactical march through a grid of dead soldiers. Thousands of identical white marble headstones stood in perfect, unyielding formation. They stretched out into the whiteout conditions, disappearing into the storm. There was no color here, just gray sky, white snow, and gray stone. The smell of damp earth and frost-burned grass fought its way through the freezing air. High above, a solitary crow let out a harsh, jagged cry. The sound tore through the silence like a rusty blade. We walked deep into Section 8. Mercer stopped abruptly. There was a headstone. It looked exactly like the rest. No flowers, no small flags, just a thick, heavy layer of ice and packed snow burying the marker. Mercer dropped to one knee. He did not care about the snow soaking into his expensive tailored trousers. He pulled off his heavy black leather glove. He reached out with his bare, weathered hand and scraped the ice away from the stone. The frozen chunks fell away, revealing the carved letters. Earl Patterson, Sergeant, United States Army. Mercer stayed on his knee. He kept his eyes locked on the granite. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, heavy rumble. It sounded like a casualty report delivered in a war room. Fallujah, 2004. Mercer's breath plumed in a thick white cloud. Insurgent ambush. My Humvee took a direct hit from a rocket-propelled grenade. The armor peeled open like a cheap tin can. I stood perfectly still. The wind whipped snow against my face, stinging my skin like shattered glass. I was trapped in the passenger seat. Mercer continued, his voice devoid of any theatrical emotion. It was just the ugly, raw truth. The cabin was burning. Toxic smoke from the melted wiring and burning diesel fuel filled the rig. Sergeant Patterson ignored a direct order to fall back. He ran straight into the fire. Mercer swallowed hard. The sound was audible over the howling wind. He dragged my burning body out of that wreckage. He inhaled so much of that chemical smoke it burned away half of his left lung. He spent 2 months on a ventilator in Germany. He saved my life. He gave up his own air so I could breathe. The words hit me. They hit me harder than a physical blow. My hands balled into tight fists inside my jacket pockets. I squeezed my fingers together until my fingernails dug straight through the thick calluses on my palms. They broke the skin. I felt the warm, sticky pull of my own blood. I did not loosen my grip. The universe had a sick, twisted sense of humor. I did not just let an old man die in a dark hallway. I let a hero die. A man who sacrificed his lungs in the desert dirt only to suffocate on a sterile hospital gurney in Boston because a backup generator failed. I looked down at the general. The iron shell I had built around my mind cracked wide open. The sheer exhaustion of carrying this lie for 3 years poured into my bones. The silence between us was no longer an option. The hospital ran out of money for the backup grid, I said. My voice was ragged, stripped completely bare. My father diverted the maintenance budget to cover a bad financial investment in a private surgical clinic. When the power died that night, there was only one machine left. Mercer did not look up. He just listened to the howling wind. They needed a body to take the fall. They needed someone to bury the criminal negligence so the Department of Defense grants would not dry up. The words tasted like ash and copper in my mouth. I signed the paperwork. I took the hit. I waited for the explosion. I waited for the 4-star general to stand up, draw his weapon, or wrap his massive hands around my throat. He had every right to destroy me right there in the snow. Instead, Mercer slowly got to his feet. He brushed the frozen snow off his overcoat. He looked older now. The predatory, intimidating edge from the parking lot was completely gone. He looked like a man carrying the weight of a ghost. When they admitted Earl to your emergency room, he was conscious for the first 10 minutes, Mercer said. His voice was thick, choked with gravel and old grief. He knew his lungs were failing. He knew exactly what was happening around him. Mercer reached deep into the inside breast pocket of his coat. He gave me a direct order, a dying man's final command. Mercer pulled out a folded, yellowed envelope. The edges were worn soft from being carried in a pocket for 3 years. He ordered me to leave the hospital alone. He ordered me not to destroy the doctor who made the call. Mercer stepped forward. He grabbed my wrist. His grip was absolute iron. He shoved the envelope into my bare, bleeding hand. The aged paper felt rough and dry against my freezing skin. He bought my life with his lungs. Mercer whispered, his gray eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that burned. And he bought your future with his death. Do not waste it. Mercer let go of my wrist. He turned his back on me. He walked away, his heavy boots crunching through the deep snow, heading back to the idling SUV. The exhaust smoke swallowed his silhouette. I did not follow him. I stood frozen at the foot of the grave. The bitter cold sank its teeth into my flesh. I looked down at the crumpled, yellowed envelope clutched in my hand. My apartment was a box. 4 bare walls, a stained mattress on the floor, and a single overhead neon tube that buzzed like a dying wasp. The air always smelled of cheap laundry detergent and stale radiator heat. It was a concrete cell for a disgraced officer, and for 3 years I believed it was exactly what I deserved. I sat cross-legged on the scuffed hardwood floor. I was still wearing the clothes from the alleyway, smelling of road salt and freezing wind. The yellowed envelope rested on my thigh. The paper felt rough under my fingertips, dry and brittle like dead skin. I stared at it for a long time. The buzzing of the neon light overhead was the only sound in the room. Inhale. Hold for 3 seconds. Exhale. Sniper breathing. Regulate the heart rate. Do not let the central nervous system panic before the trigger breaks. I ran through the cycle 3 times until the shaking in my hands completely stopped. I slid my thumb under the sealed flap and tore it open. The paper ripped with a sharp, dry rasp. I pulled out a single sheet of standard VA hospital stationery. The printed letterhead at the top was crisp and professional, but the handwriting below it was a disaster. It was jagged, erratic. The pen strokes dug so deep into the paper, they almost tore right through the fiber. It was the handwriting of a man fighting a losing war for every single breath, his brain starved of oxygen, forcing his hand to move across the page by sheer stubborn willpower. Major Sharp, the letter began. Not Doctor, Major. He knew exactly who was standing over his stretcher that night. He saw past the scrubs and the stethoscope. If you are reading this, it means you made the right call. I stopped reading. My throat clamped shut tight and hard. I forced my eyes to drop to the next line. A broken-down machine has no business stealing gas from a race car. My lungs stayed in the sand in Fallujah a long time ago. That kid on the stretcher next to me had a whole life to burn through. Do not let the suits in the front office put this on your conscience. I chose to tap out. My breath hitched. My eyes darted across the jagged ink, tracing the heavy pressure of the pen. I saw your eyes, Major. I knew the math. I knew what you had to do, and I took the choice away from you. I told the nurses I was a do not resuscitate before I went under. Do not throw your career away for a soldier past his expiration date. Stand tall. Never break rank for the cowards. Sergeant Earl Patterson. I dropped the paper to the floor. It fluttered down, landing on the scratched wood. I did not cry. Crying was a civilian luxury. Instead, I locked my jaw. I clamped my teeth together so hard the tendons in my neck strained and cramped. I kept biting down, grinding my molars until I tasted the sharp, hot tang of copper pooling under my tongue. I swallowed my own blood. It tasted like iron. For 36 months, I carried the crushing weight of a murderer. I let the local papers drag my name through the mud. I let the public spit on my reputation. I scrubbed crust off burned skillets in a high-end kitchen for minimum wage, serving the elites, punishing myself every single day for a medical sin I never committed. Earl Patterson did not die because I failed him. He died because he threw himself on a grenade to save my soul. A stranger. A half-dead army grunt with nothing left to his name gave up his final breaths to protect my career. He willingly surrendered his spot on the only working ventilator so I wouldn't have to carry the guilt of a fatal triage decision. And my own blood, my family. The image of Dr. Richard Sharp flashed into my mind. I saw him sitting behind his massive polished glass desk in the climate-controlled boardroom, wearing his $3,000 custom suit, tapping his designer pen. He knew. Richard had access to all the charts. He knew Patterson was a DNR. He knew the old soldier went willingly into the dark. But Richard needed a scapegoat. The hospital's maintenance budget had been gutted to fund private executive bonuses. When the backup generator failed, it was a corporate crime. Richard needed a distraction to keep the hospital's stock options from taking a dive. He needed a sacrificial lamb to appease the Department of Defense and protect their massive trauma research grants. So my father looked his own daughter in the eye, handed her a typed confession, and forced her to cut her own throat. A stranger bought my life with his blood. My father sold it for a quarterly dividend. Something inside my chest snapped. It was not a loud break. It was the quiet, terrifying sound of a heavy steel cable snapping under extreme tension. The heavy, suffocating blanket of shame I had worn for 3 years vanished in a fraction of a second. It was replaced by a vast, freezing void. And then the void filled. Fury. Cold, calculated, military-grade fury. The kind of anger that does not scream or throw punches at the wall. The kind of anger that quietly loads a magazine and calculates wind resistance. I spat the blood from my mouth onto the hardwood floor. I did not wipe it up. I stood up. My back was perfectly straight. I walked across the small, cramped room to the tiny bedroom closet. I bypassed the cheap denim jeans and the grease-stained work shirts. I dropped to one knee and grabbed the heavy iron handle of the olive drab ammo can shoved deep in the back corner. I dragged it out into the light. The metal scraped harshly against the floorboards. I flipped the heavy steel latches. Clack, clack. The sound was crisp, final. I pushed the lid back. The smell of gun oil, heavy starch, and old dust drifted up into the neon light. Folded perfectly inside, pressed with extreme military precision, was my Marine Corps combat utility uniform, the woodland Marpat camouflage. Pinned to the collar was the dull gold oak leaf of a major. It had been sitting in the dark, waiting. I reached under the folded fabric and pulled out a dull silver chain. 2 metal dog tags clinked together. The metallic chime cut through the silence of the apartment like a church bell. I slipped the chain over my head. The cold metal settled heavily against my collarbone, right over my pulse. I was done hiding in the grease and the steam. I was done scraping plates for people who wouldn't last 5 seconds in a war zone. I was done taking orders from cowards hiding behind glass walls, NDAs, and corporate letterheads. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cracked cell phone. The screen cast a harsh, artificial glare in the dim room. I opened my messages. I selected the contact I had not spoken to since the day I handed over my hospital ID badge. Richard Sharp. My thumbs moved rapidly over the cracked glass. I did not type a greeting. I did not ask for a favor. I did not ask for my family back. I issued a command. Arrange a board meeting. Tomorrow morning. Be there. I hit send. I tossed the phone onto the mattress. I looked down at the camouflage uniform in the metal box. The dishwasher was dead. The major was clocking in, 50 stories up. The executive boardroom of the Boston 5A hospital hovered over the city like a glass fortress. Inside, the air conditioning was cranked down to a sterile, freezing chill. The room smelled of expensive leather, lemon polish, and arrogance. I pushed through the heavy oak double doors. My scuffed combat boots sank into the plush carpet. I was wearing my faded canvas jacket and dark denim. Underneath the cheap cotton shirt, the cold silver of Earl Patterson's dog tags rested flat against my collarbone. Dr. Richard Sharp sat at the head of the massive glass table. My father. He wore a charcoal Brioni suit. Next to him sat my uncle, Arthur Sharp, the hospital director, scrolling through a tablet. Richard looked up. He didn't smile. His eyes dragged over my clothes, his upper lip twitching in pure disgust. You demanded an emergency board meeting. Richard said, his voice flat. He checked his gold Rolex. You have exactly 5 minutes. Did you drag us up here to beg for your old job? Or do you just need cash to fix that garbage truck you drive? Arthur chuckled, not looking up from his screen. We don't give handouts to disgraced dishwashers, Holly. You signed the paperwork. You are dead to this administration. I didn't answer. I pulled out a heavy leather chair and sat down. Back perfectly straight, shoulders squared, both feet planted flat on the floor. I reached into my jacket, pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder, and tossed it onto the glass table. Smack! The sharp crack of heavy paper hitting tempered glass echoed in the massive room. I'm not here for money, I said. My voice was a dead flat calm, the voice of a commanding officer calling in a targeted strike. I'm here to deliver the internal audit. Richard frowned. He reached out and flipped the cover open. Page 4, I commanded. An internal email dated December 14th, 3 years ago, sent from your private server to maintenance. You explicitly canceled the replacement order for the backup diesel generators. Richard's hand froze, hovering over the paper. Page 7. I continued, not missing a beat. The accounting ledger. You diverted the exact cost of those generators, $400,000, into the executive fourth quarter bonus pool. You cashed that check 2 weeks before the winter storm knocked out the city grid. The silence in the room suddenly turned suffocating. Arthur finally put his tablet down. His face was losing color. You gutted the emergency infrastructure to buy a second boat, I said, staring dead into Richard's eyes. When the power died that night, there was only one ventilator left. Not because of an act of God, because of an act of corporate greed. Your profit margins killed Earl Patterson, not me. Richard's jaw tightened. He closed the folder, pushing it away like it was infected. He forced a cold, condescending smirk. You stole confidential hospital property, Richard sneered, leaning forward. That is a federal crime. Furthermore, no one is going to look at these documents. You signed a full confession taking sole responsibility for the triage failure. It is permanently on your record. Arthur leaned back, regaining his smirking confidence. You're a washed-up blue-collar loser, Holly. The medical board stripped your license. The military threw you out. Who the hell is going to believe a kitchen rat over the chief of surgery, right on cue? The heavy oak doors at the back of the room swung open. The hinges groaned. A rush of cold air from the hallway sucked the stale tension right out of the room. Heavy boots stepped onto the carpet. I will. General Thomas Mercer walked into the boardroom. He wasn't wearing his civilian overcoat today. He was in full-dress uniform. 4 silver stars gleaming on his shoulders. A chest completely covered in combat ribbons. He looked like an apex predator stepping into a cage of terrified mice. Behind him walked 2 men in crisp dark uniforms. Military lawyers, the Judge Advocate General's Corps, JAG. Arthur shot up out of his chair. General Mercer, you can't just barge in here. This is a private corporate meeting. Mercer ignored him completely. He walked straight to the glass table and planted both his massive hands on it. He stared down at Richard Sharp. The Department of Defense funds 70% of this hospital's trauma research, Mercer growled. His voice vibrated against the glass. Effective 0800 this morning, the Pentagon has frozen every single one of your accounts. We are pulling the grants. Richard's gold pen slipped from his fingers. It clattered against the glass and rolled off the edge, hitting the floor. His face turned the color of spoiled milk. General, please. There is a misunderstanding. We can discuss the funding. There is no discussion. Mercer cut him off, his voice cracking like a whip. He pointed a thick-scarred finger at the manila folder. Major Sharp provided the United States military with hard evidence of wire fraud and criminal negligence resulting in the death of a decorated Army veteran. The FBI is currently pulling up to your loading dock with federal warrants. Arthur sank back into his chair, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocated fish. Total system failure. The arrogant, untouchable C-level executives were suddenly facing federal prison. The rules they used to crush the working class had just wrapped around their own throats. I stood up. My chair scraped loudly against the floor. I didn't yell. I didn't gloat. I didn't demand an apology from the men who had ruined the last 3 years of my life. They were entirely beneath my anger. I reached down and slowly buttoned my canvas jacket. I looked at Richard Sharp one last time. The decision I made that night in the trauma bay was my bullet. I said quietly. The words sliced through the air, razor sharp and absolute. I took it. I carried it. I turned my back to the glass table. Now it's your turn. I walked away. I didn't look back as I pushed through the oak doors, leaving the general and his lawyers to execute the rest of the strike. I rode the elevator down 50 floors. The lobby was chaotic. Federal agents and windbreakers were swarming the reception desk, flashing badges, locking down the elevators. I slipped right past them. I was invisible again. As I pushed through the revolving glass doors, a hand caught my shoulder. I turned. General Mercer stood in the entryway. He held out a folded piece of heavy bank paper, a certified cashier's check, blank except for his signature at the bottom. The hospital owes you 3 years of back pay, Mercer said roughly. And my family owes you a debt we can never repay. Fill in the number, Major. You earned it. I looked at the check. It was a golden ticket. It was a new house, a new practice, a clean slate. I reached up and touched the cold metal of Earl Patterson's dog tags through my shirt. Keep it, General. I said, my voice steady. I'm already paid in full. I stepped back out of his reach. The heavy glass doors rotated, spitting me out onto the Boston sidewalk. The winter fog was thick, rolling off the harbor in dense gray waves. It swallowed the tops of the skyscrapers, hiding the glass and steel. The air was freezing, biting at my lungs. It smelled like salt, wet asphalt, and freedom. I shoved my hands deep into my pockets. I kept my head up my shoulders, pulled back my spine perfectly straight. I merged into the faceless crowd of morning commuters, a ghost disappearing into the mist. I didn't know where I was going to eat dinner tonight. But for the first time in 3 years, I knew I wouldn't be eating it on my knees. If this story hit you right in the chest, hit that like button, subscribe for more gritty audio stories, and I'll see you in the next one.